If we look at a timeline, after Abraham and all of that, we finally get to Moses and the Exodus. And then after the Exodus, ultimately they'll come back and settle the land and go through, and the monarchy will emerge and under David. And then eventually they will get captured by Babylon. I want to look a little more closely at the period of time that this psalm is really echoing, if you will. And after the monarchy, they go into the Babylonian captivity for 70 years. They come out of that, and the period after that is called the post-exile period. And we have Haggai and Zechariah as the post-exile prophets, and we have the history of Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and all of that before we get to the New Testament. But it's interesting that the Babylonian captivity itself doesn't have any record of what's going on inside it. We know they were taken slaves. We know when Cyrus conquers Babylon, he frees them, but there's this 70-year time where we have a little insight. And Babylon conquered the region. The first siege of Nebuchadnezzar, he took the captives that included Daniel and his friends. Ezekiel in Babylon and Jeremiah in Jerusalem preached to the people to yield to Nebuchadnezzar. He's the instrument of God, and God is using it as his judgment. And the false prophets convinced the king that, no, they're God's chosen people, we should rebel, and they did. Nebuchadnezzar puts them down again and puts a different king in charge, subject to him, of course. The second siege takes some more captives. Jeremiah in Jerusalem and Ezekiel in Babylon preach along the lines that yield to Nebuchadnezzar. If you rebel again, he'll destroy Jerusalem. Right now, Jerusalem's run by them. They're enslaved, but they still have their city. Well, again, the false prophets talk them into rebelling again. By the time they do that again, Nebuchadnezzar has had a belly full of the whole operation. He levels the place, takes them all. Slaves. The third siege of Nebuchadnezzar. Important to understand there are three sieges. Many people miss on this. The servitude of the nation begins with the first siege. That's when the nation became captive as a nation. Jerusalem was still subject to them, but in existence. The decree of Cyrus the Persian conquers Babylon, and Daniel greets him and shows him the letter that God wrote to him 150 years earlier. That's in our book of Isaiah. And he's so impressed because he has his career, his name all mentioned to him, written 150 years earlier. He's impressed with that. He releases them to go home and gives them financial incentives to go home under the decree of Cyrus. So a group, about 50,000, go home go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. It's all in rubbles, but they go to rebuild their temple. The decree of Cyrus is in effect the rule of the Persian Empire as far as Israel is concerned. The desolations of Jerusalem started with the third siege of Nebuchadnezzar, and it isn't until Nehemiah, when they return after Cyrus, under Ezra, they try to rebuild the temple, but they're harassed because of they're not in a position to defend themselves, and it's a meager effort. Until Nehemiah, who is cupbearer to the king Artaxerxes, a successor then to in the Greek scheme of things, gives Nehemiah the authority to go rebuild the city walls. And so it's under Nehemiah, under his term, they're allowed to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. Now the reason that's so important, the decree of Artaxerxes is the trigger, if you will, to the 70 weeks of Daniel prophecy. It's very important. It turns out to be very precise, very, very thrilling piece of work. But what's interesting, the servitude of the nation was to be 70 years. The desolations of Jerusalem were also predicted to be 70 years, but they're not coterminous. The desolations start later, and they are relieved, but each one is fulfilled to the day prophetically. But the real point I'm getting at, this is just by way of review for most of you, is that what really occurred in Babylon during the servitude of the nation isn't recorded. We know there were slaves, but there isn't a lot of visibility. The psalm we're going to see gives us a glimpse of some of that. That's why I'm going through some of this, okay? Second Chronicles carries us up to about Cyrus, and then Ezra and Nehemiah follow, as I indicated. And of course, the book of Esther occurs probably in about the days of Ezra, in which it's pretty important because she made possible the situation for Nehemiah to follow later. And if it hadn't been for her, Jerusalem would not have been rebuilt. There would have been a whole different history. The Hebrew nation would probably have been wiped out some 500 years before Christ was born, and it would have changed the destiny of mankind. So the whole saga of Esther is much deeper than most people have any idea. But Daniel, of course, and Ezekiel are the prophets during the captivity period, and Haggai and Zechariah are known as the post-exile prophets, to give you just a historical perspective, and Malachi even later.